Let me just give you a quick summary of what happens in those chapters. So Jacob blesses his 12 sons as he lies on his deathbed. He starts with the eldest, Reuben, and he works his way down to the youngest, Benjamin. Um, and through it, he blesses them. Sometimes he curses them. He raises some of the things that happened in their life. So Reuben slept with one of Jacob's wives, and so he, isn't happy with him. Simeon and Levi attack some people, and so he isn't happy with them. Judah is pretty much positive the whole way through. He mentions that the father's sons, all of his brothers, will bow down to him. We'll come back to that at the end. But after he blesses the 12 sons, he dies, and he is taken back to the cave where Abraham and Sarah were laid in their death, along with Isaac and Rebekah. And Jacob has already left Leah there, and now he will lay there with them, back in the land of the promise in Canaan. We're told a little bit about something of the ceremony that happens at Jacob's burial. Joseph is there, and he spends some days mourning and grieving, and the people in the land notice that grieving. And then we hear that when they come back to the land of Egypt, the brothers are worried now that Jacob is dead. They're worried because they think that Joseph might finally chase them down for revenge. Now that Jacob's out of the picture, he'll finally get his revenge. That's what they're worried about. So what they do is they come up with this lie, a message that they send to Joseph before, and the message says that before your father died, he said that you are to leave the brothers alone and to forgive them. And this message makes Joseph weep, and he finds his brothers and he comes to them and he says, the brothers come to him, and they threw themselves down before him, and they say, "We are your slaves." Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And then he reassures them and he speaks kindly to them. And then after that happens, we hear about Joseph's death, and his dying wish is that his body be taken up out of Egypt to the promised land when God brings them into the promised land. So there you go. There's a little bit of a summary of what happens in these two chapters. I just want to finish the book of Genesis by showing that these two chapters sort of wrap up some of the big themes in the story. The ending of Genesis is masterful, and it does three things. Firstly, it points forward to the Messiah in a really interesting way. See, when Jacob is blessing the sons, those blessings are going to become really important as we continue to read the story, and particularly as you notice the blessing that he gives to Judah. Jacob is the first to say that the line of the Messiah, that is the snake crusher from Genesis chapter 3, the one who would bring an end to evil and bring in God's kingdom, this person is going to come from the family of Judah. So Jacob says to Judah, the scepter will not depart from Judah. So the kings are going to come from Judah, and ultimately the Messiah. But also Jacob says, Judah, your brothers will praise you, your father's sons will bow down to you. Now, what I've always found interesting about the last 15 or so chapters of Genesis is that they focus on Joseph's story when Joseph isn't from the line of the Messiah. You know, we're taught from a young age that the whole Bible is about Jesus. So why do we spend so much time looking at Joseph when he isn't a direct relative of the Messiah? I've always wondered why we don't hear more about Judah. since he is the one who is in the line of the Messiah. But this verse here, this is the key to understanding. Judah, your father's sons will bow down to you. Now remember, in the Joseph story, Joseph has this dream that his brothers, his father's sons, will bow down to him. Joseph is the one who his brothers bowed down to. So what Jacob is saying to Judah is that Judah's descendant, the Messiah, is going to be like Joseph. The reason we have the Joseph story in such intricate detail is because the Messiah's story is going to be like Joseph's story. That's why this one little line is so important to understanding Genesis and how the Messiah fits into this story. Judah, your father's sons will bow down to you. The story of the Messiah is like the story of Joseph, even though the Messiah himself isn't a descendant of Joseph. And now that we live on this side of the Messiah, we can look back at the two stories and we can see the similarities. The Messiah, Jesus, he had a drastic downturn. Let me start again. Joseph's story is characterized by a drastic downward spiral, enslavement, betrayal, imprisonment, and he ends up in a pit. But then it's ultimately followed by vindication, where he's raised up, 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 and he ends up seated at the right hand of the enthroned one. And we know, as people who live this side of Jesus, that is the story of the Messiah. Jesus didn't consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he took on the nature of a servant, just like Joseph, and he made himself nothing. He became obedient to death, even death on a cross. And therefore, God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every other name. So that at the name of Jesus, you know how it goes. Can you see that the story of the Messiah is the story of Joseph? And that is why this one line in the promises to the sons is so important. The Messiah is going to be like Joseph. So that's the first one. The other two are much quicker. This last episode of Genesis, it draws Genesis to a close by reminding us of the big theme of Genesis. Genesis has been about God taking chaos and making his good purpose out of it. That's what's happened in this story. He takes a chaotic situation and he makes his good purposes happen out of it. So the story of Joseph is a story of enslavement resulting in the saving of many lives. The chaos of the hatred of brothers and the enslavement of Joseph results in the saving of many lives. God takes chaos and he makes good. You go back a generation and you look at the chaos of Isaac's family, if you remember it. Isaac favors Esau, Rebekah favors Jacob. Isaac tries to bless Esau without blessing Jacob. Jacob and Rebekah decide to deceive Isaac, and Jacob has to run away, and he ends up being deceived by Laban. It's all just an utter mess. It's chaos. But through the chaos, God brings about his good purpose. His purpose happens through the chaos. Even all the way back in Genesis chapter 1, we see God bringing about his good purposes through the chaos, as he takes the watery chaos of creation and he makes his good creation out of it. Genesis is about God taking chaos and making his good purposes out of it. It reminds me of this kind of art. Have a look at this video I'm going to show you. Chaotic situation, but chaos can be made good. That's what God is doing in Genesis. And the last one, the third and final thing, is that Genesis finishes by showing us that the story isn't over yet. It finishes by reminding us of the plot tension that drives the story forward. Joseph says to his brothers, "When I die, do not let me be buried in Egypt, but bury me in the land that God has promised." Remember that God has still got a promise, and the promise is of land for the Israelites. The story can't end in Egypt. It has to go back to the promised land. And so, as we continue reading in Exodus, we'll hear more about how that story plays out. Thanks for joining us for Genesis. We pick up Exodus next week. I'm looking forward to it. God bless.